It has the longest freshwater coast in America, Michigan. A land of blue waters, brilliant skies, and giant industry. It was here where timber and steel helped create one of the greatest manufacturing centers in the world. Where one man's passion for invention gave birth to America's love affair with cars. And where icons of that industry still stand tall. It was from Michigan that bootleggers once supplied America with illegal rum. And musical superstars from Stevie Wonder to Madonna headed out to entertain the world. Ariel, Michigan tells the story of the workers who brought America's largest industrial corporation to its knees and helped win battles of World War II, where a hometown team reigns supreme in one of the biggest rivalries in American sports. Thanks to its unique shape, locals often called their state the Mitten. But the rest of the world knows this Midwestern powerhouse as Michigan. This isn't your average American highway. It's a weekday morning, but all of its lanes are empty, except for one truck. This is what's called a proving ground, a place where America's automakers put their latest vehicles through tough tests before rolling them out across the country. It was the automobile that transformed Michigan into one of the greatest manufacturing centers in the world. And much of that credit belongs to one car, known as the Model T. It all started here in Dearborn, just a few miles west of Detroit. In 1908, the first Model T rolled off Henry Ford's assembly line. This horseless carriage was the first lightweight, reliable, and most importantly, inexpensive car ever made. To help convince ordinary families to buy his $850 cars, Ford famously offered to double many of his own workers' wages so they too could afford the cars they built. The Model T was an unimaginable success. Over the next 19 years, 15 million Americans across the country bought Model Ts, and America's love affair with the automobile was born. This may be the best place to imagine what life was like back in the days when the first automobiles rolled out onto America's streets. It's a place known as Greenfield Village. Henry Ford wasn't just obsessed with cars. He was fascinated with all kinds of inventions and created an entire village just to celebrate them. At the heart of Greenfield Village lies Thomas Edison's invention factory. It was in this Menlo Park complex where Edison first demonstrated his incandescent light bulb. Ford moved the surviving buildings from New Jersey and recreated the rest. Next door lies the Henry Ford Museum. It houses one of the most diverse automobile collections in the world. Inside this vast complex is the limousine in which President Kennedy was assassinated, the bus in which civil rights activist Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat, the first Ford Mustang, and the last Model T ever made. By 1914, 1,000 Model Ts rolled off Ford's assembly lines every day, which made him a very wealthy man. He bought 1,300 acres of land and commissioned a new home, Fair Lane Estate. He warned his architects that he only wanted to spend $250,000 on this 56-room house. But after hundreds of masons, carpenters, and other artisans worked around the clock for 2 straight years, the final bill came in at nearly $2 million. What made the estate unique was that it had its own hydroelectric power station. Ford had designed it with help from his good friend, Thomas Edison. Built on this stretch of the Rouge River that ran through his property, Ford installed 2 generators that powered the entire estate, as well as the homes of 2,000 residents of West Dearborn. A 300-foot-long underground tunnel carried steam, electricity, and water from the plant to his residence. Oddly enough, the man most responsible for a world of cars lived in a home that was practically carbon neutral. Meanwhile, gas-powered vehicles of all shapes and sizes were rolling off the assembly lines of Ford, General Motors, Oldsmobile, and other early automakers. This new industry transformed Michigan, and there's no better place to see that transformation than downtown Detroit. In 1927, the 7 Fisher brothers, who owned the company that first mass-produced the automobile body, commissioned this skyscraper for their new headquarters. They gave Michigan's great architect Albert Kahn a blank check to design a tower that would grace the city like none had before. When it was completed in 1928, many called it the most beautiful building in the world, a cathedral to commerce. At first, real gold covered its tower, but that was removed during World War II for fear that the Fisher Building would become the target of enemy bombers. As Detroit's skyline expanded in the 1920s, its culture thrived. The Fox Theater opened its doors in 1928. Funded by movie pioneer William Fox, it was the first in the world to have built-in equipment for sound. Later, it became a venue for live shows. Sinatra, Elvis, and native Detroiters, The Temptations, and Eminem have all performed here. By the 1970s, the Fox had fallen into disrepair, but a $12.5 million renovation has recently restored this Art Deco landmark. Not all of Detroit's great architecture from its heyday in the 1920s has been so lucky. This is Michigan's Central Station, or what's left of it. When it opened in 1913, it was the tallest railway station in the world. Roman baths inspired the design of its grand station on the lower floors. During the heyday of rail travel, up to 200 trains arrived and departed from here every day. Charlie Chaplin wasn't the only famous passenger to disembark here. 3 presidents did too: Roosevelt, Hoover, and Truman. The last train left Michigan Station more than 20 years ago. Its platforms stand empty. Platforms that were once the last stop for thousands of workers seeking jobs on Detroit's assembly lines. And they came from all over the world. As the demand for cars rose across the country, automakers needed labor to build them. Tens of thousands flocked to Michigan looking for work, many from as far away as the Middle East. Today, Dearborn is home to the largest mosque in the United States. That's because 1/3 of all Dearborn residents claim Arab American heritage. Dearborn's population of immigrants from Lebanon and Syria and other countries in the Middle East grew rapidly in the early 20th century. Most were Christian, but later, increasing numbers of Muslim Arabs arrived. And in 1963, the community built this mosque, the Islamic Center of America. Along with labor, the big automakers also needed something else to keep their assembly lines moving: raw materials. And the most important of these was steel. To ensure his factories had a steady supply, Ford built this plant. First fired up nearly a century ago, this facility once supplied the steel for Model Ts. Now it's being upgraded to turn out lightweight, rust-resistant body panels for new models of cars. It's owned by Severstal, one of Russia's largest steel companies. Steel in Michigan remains a burning hot business. This fiery liquid, called slag, is a byproduct of turning iron ore into steel and will be used to build roads. The automotive industry has driven Michigan's economy for more than a century. But out beyond its assembly lines and towers of industry, Michigan is a very different land. A land defined since its earliest beginnings by water. It's said that every resident in the state is less than 85 miles from one of 4 of America's Great Lakes. Erie in the southeast, Huron to its east, Superior to the north, or Michigan on its west coast. Once, this area was covered by a great sheet of ice called the Wisconsin Glacier. After that ice melted, roughly 14,000 years ago, Paleo-Indians arrived. They hunted mastodons and mammoths, caribou and beaver. More recently, descendants of these early tribes explored the area's waterways in dugout canoes, fishing the many inlets that still line Michigan's coast today. From the air, this is as varied a shoreline as any in North America. Endless beaches, remote pine forests that reach right down to the water, miles of marsh, and a giant wall of sand towering above Lake Michigan. It's called Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore and is often ranked among the nation's tallest sand dunes. But that's not quite accurate. This isn't a typical dune. The sand on its surface actually rests atop a bluff of rock and gravel left by a glacier, which is why it's called a perched dune. But scientists say that it may not be perched here for long. Westerly winds off Lake Michigan are moving Sleeping Bear Dune inland at an average rate of 2 feet per year. It's 450 feet high from top to bottom. Climbing back up can be hard work. Pulitzer Prize-winning author Carl Sandburg has said that these dunes are to the Midwest what the Grand Canyon is to Arizona and the Yosemite to California, a signature of time and eternity. Once, natural landmarks like this one on Michigan's coast helped guide the Native Americans and European explorers who first navigated the Great Lakes. Just as Michigan's lighthouses do for ship captains today. There are more than 120 lighthouses on Michigan's shores. That's more than in any other state, including Maine. Efforts are underway to save these historic structures, since many of these beacons are no longer in service, at least for ships. Today, this one, on Big Sable Point, is being used to pop the question. One reason there are so many lighthouses in Michigan is because this state has a very long coast. More than 3,200 miles, making it the longest freshwater coast of any state. Not the easiest shoreline to map in a canoe. But that's what a French Jesuit priest tried to do in the 1670s. Hoping to find a passage to China and convert a few Native Americans along the way, Father Jacques Marquette set off with a party and 2 canoes to explore and map the shores of the Great Lakes. He never found his passage, but by the time the expedition was done, 5 months later, he had documented more than 2,000 miles of shoreline. He also founded a Jesuit mission on what's now the Canadian border, in the northernmost part of the state. That settlement became the city of Sault Ste. Marie, which is among the oldest cities in the United States, and home to the Sioux Locks. All freighters sailing from New York, Chicago, or Detroit to Lake Superior have to travel through these locks. The reason the locks are necessary is because the water level in Lake Superior is 21 feet higher than that in Lake Huron. In the old days, cargo had to be carried around nearby rapids. But in 1853, the state of Michigan commissioned these locks so a single vessel could travel throughout all the Great Lakes without having to transfer its cargo. This bulk carrier, the Indiana Harbor, is on its way south. It arrived in the lock at the level of Lake Superior. Now, water from the lock is being released, lowering the ship 21 feet to the same water level as Lake Huron. From here, this 1,000-foot-long vessel will carry its cargo of iron ore down to steel plants in Michigan and other Midwestern states. To lower a ship this size, it takes just 12 minutes. And workers here know that there's no time to waste. 10,000 vessels pass through the Soo locks every year, making it the busiest locks in the world. The Soo locks lie on Michigan's Upper Peninsula, a place that used to be completely separated from the Michigan mainland, until a remarkable feat of engineering brought the two Michigans together. It's not a typical morning in northern Michigan. High above the Straits of Mackinac, tens of thousands of people are on the move. But they're not taking part in a mass protest or making a morning commute. This is the annual Labor Day crossing of Michigan's mighty Mack Bridge. Every year, thousands come from across the state to celebrate the role of this bridge in linking Michigan's upper and lower peninsulas. Once, this divided state was part of a single landmass until it was severed by retreating glacial ice. As surrounding waters flowed in, they formed the Straits of Mackinac that now divide Michigan into two very different pieces. The only way to cross the straits was by air or water, but in 1957, the Mackinac Bridge was completed. Its span measures in at 26,372 feet, making it the longest suspension bridge in the Western Hemisphere. Its two main cables are suspended from towers that soar over 500 feet into the air. G. Menon Williams, the Michigan governor who oversaw the project, announced that the bridge ranks with the pyramids, the great hydroelectric dams, the skyscrapers of Manhattan, and the Panama and Suez Canals. But not everyone up here is so happy about the mighty Mack. On the northern end of this constructed marvel is Michigan's beloved natural one, the Upper Peninsula, also known as the UP. The UP makes up almost a third of the state, but is home to only 3% of Michigan's population. UP residents, who can often be identified by distinctive accents, refer to themselves as Upers. Some of them wish the bridge had never been built, and have even called those who live below it trolls. Some Upers have even launched movements for the UP to secede and to establish its own 51st American state, to be called Superior, after their own Great Lake. It might sound far-fetched, but actually, the idea of an independent Upper Peninsula may not be such a crazy one. The fact is, most of the UP was not originally intended to be part of Michigan. In the 1830s, the population of the Michigan Territory reached 60,000, which meant it could now apply for U.S. statehood. But at the time, Michigan and Ohio were in a nasty battle over a piece of land sandwiched between them, which would have given each state potentially lucrative shipping routes to the Mississippi River. This piece of land is now known as the Toledo Strip. The federal government finally awarded the 468 square mile Toledo Strip to Ohio, and in compensation, gave 9,000 square miles in the Upper Peninsula to Michigan. At the time, many here thought that the UP was destined to remain forever a wilderness. Little did anyone know, their new land held buried treasure. Just 5 years after Michigan received statehood, vast deposits of copper and other precious ore were discovered in the UP. Soon, this forested region bustled with miners who produced more than 5 million tons of copper by the mid-20th century. Those days are now gone. The last copper mines closed here in 1995, and the forests of the UP are quiet again. The mighty Mackinac Bridge finally connected Michigan's two peninsulas, but just a few miles to the east lies an island that can still seem lost in time. Surrounded by waters rich in fish and positioned at the mouth of the straits, Mackinac Island was first inhabited by Native Americans, then French fur traders, and later the British, who established this fort here in 1780. The U.S. government took control of the island in 1796, but then lost it. On the night of July 17, 1812, the 30 American troops stationed here were asleep when 300 British soldiers and Native American allies who had sailed from Canada landed on the backside of the island. Quietly in the dark, they pulled a cannon up the hill and aimed it at Fort Mackinac. When the Americans awoke to discover that they were staring down the barrel of a cannon and were outnumbered 10-1, they surrendered without a fight. It was the first land engagement of the War of 1812. But 2 years later, after Britain lost that war, Fort Mackinac was safely returned to U.S. hands. The island's rich history and isolation is also its charm. The story goes that someone once brought a car to the island, but after it scared the horses here, it was banned. Horse carriages and bicycles are now the only vehicles allowed on Mackinac streets. Perched high above the straits is the Grand Hotel. It's been full nearly every summer since it opened in 1887. Mark Twain used to offer lectures to the hotel's guests for $1 each. The grand 660-foot-long porch is the longest in the world. Once it was the gathering place for just about everyone on this tiny island. And it was on this porch where actors Christopher Reeve and Jane Seymour filmed the romantic cult classic, Somewhere in Time. But this island also played a small role in a much more epic tale, the creation of Michigan's great city, Detroit. In 1701, a French commander named Antoine de la Motte Cadillac, who was in charge of Mackinac Island, headed south and arrived on the banks of this river, which links Lake Erie with Lake Huron. Cadillac had been given permission from the French government to build a fort here. He wanted to keep this vital waterway out of British hands and reap personal profits by controlling trade, especially trade in rum to Native Americans. He claimed his new fort would be the paradise of North America. It was named Detroit after the French word le détroit, or the strait. Cadillac would have a hard time recognizing the place today, and he might be surprised that most Americans know his name. In 1902, Henry Leland founded Cadillac Automobiles, which General Motors turned into one of America's best-known luxury cars. Detroit's location on a major shipping route and its close proximity to raw materials like ore and timber helped it grow into an important industrial and financial center, one that rivaled San Francisco, Chicago, and New York City. But during the 1920s, Detroit had something very important that these cities didn't. In 1919, the U.S. government banned the sale and consumption of alcohol across the country. A few years later, Prohibition was in full swing, and Detroit was just a stone's throw from Canada, across the river where alcohol was still legal. Soon, the city crawled with liquor smugglers and the mafia. Detroit had no bridges to Canada at the time, only the MacArthur Bridge, which led to Belle Isle in the middle of the Detroit River, right on the Canadian border. What made Belle Isle a perfect hub for the buying and selling of liquor was that it was already a popular meeting place and recreation center for Detroiters. In the late 1800s, Detroit had hired Frederick Law Olmsted, the designer of New York's Central Park, to plan a new public park on Belle Isle. Architect Albert Kahn was commissioned to design this elaborate conservatory, which was inspired by President Thomas Jefferson's Virginia estate, Monticello. In the 1950s, the conservatory was given a collection of 600 orchids, which still remains the highlight of its botanical gardens today. But in Prohibition days, this popular island offered the perfect cover for rum smugglers from Canada to meet their buyers from Detroit. But not all of Canada's booze crossed Belle Isle's MacArthur Bridge. Vast quantities of rum, vodka, and whiskey were smuggled in boats or pulled across the river on cables. When the Detroit River froze, smugglers walked across, with bottles stowed in their high boots. Thus the term bootleggers. There was so much illegal liquor flowing through Detroit, it was the second biggest industry in the city at the time, after automobiles. The Detroit River carried 75% of all liquor smuggled into the United States during Prohibition. When the nearby Ambassador Bridge opened in 1929 and cars could drive across the borders, smuggling alcohol got a whole lot easier. Secretaries were hired to hide it in their purses. Others stowed it in false trunks. One man was even caught with a shipment of eggs, each of which had been emptied and filled with Scotch whiskey. The techniques of smuggling liquor in the 1920s are similar to those used by today's drug couriers. And Detroit's proximity to Canada still makes it a hub of illegal trade. The Ambassador Bridge is now the busiest international crossing in the U.S. for goods. Surprisingly, this vital link to the United States' biggest trading partner is the only privately owned border crossing in the country. The bridge's owner is a billionaire trucking magnate. Detroit's proximity to Canada is one of the reasons that it's no longer the state capital. After Michigan received its statehood in 1837, legislators wanted a more protected site for their capital city. So they moved it from Detroit to a little-known inland spot called the Township of Lansing, which was so small at the time, some simply called it a hole in the woods. The story goes that legislators joked when they reached their decision. They couldn't quite believe that they had chosen this tiny town of fewer than 20 people to be the capital of their new state. But their moral beliefs couldn't have been clearer. The first act of the legislature was to abolish the death penalty, making Michigan the first English-speaking territory in the world to outlaw capital punishment. Tolerance has been a core part of Michigan's history ever since. In the 19th century, it was a haven for runaway slaves fleeing the South on the Underground Railroad. And it helps explain why Michigan is home to a town popularly known as Little Bavaria. In the 19th century, German Lutheran missionaries called to their brethren back home to join them in converting Chippewa Indians to Christianity. Many were shocked by the conditions here. One wrote home saying that the most miserable village in Germany has palaces by comparison. But slowly, their little town, Frankenmuth, grew, and now looks more German than American. But it didn't always look this way. Frankenmuth was a pretty typical Midwestern community until the 1950s, when enterprising townspeople renovated it into Little Bavaria. Now, 3 million visitors a year come here to soak up the old world atmosphere and locally brewed German beer. One reason Frankenmuth is so popular is because more than 2 million Michiganders claim German heritage. The crops that Germans and other early settlers farmed in Michigan have given the state one of the most diverse crop systems in the world. Beans, cherries, sugar beets, blueberries, and wheat are only a few of the more than 200 commodities grown here. At the turn of the 20th century, a local Michigan doctor used one of the state's most plentiful crops to develop a food empire. In 1876, Dr. John Harvey Kellogg ran this vast sanitarium for the Seventh-day Adventist Church here in Battle Creek. Patients filled its rooms, hoping to benefit from Dr. Kellogg's principles of healthy living. Eat what the monkey eats, he prescribed. Simple food and not much of it. Dr. Kellogg's prescribed regimen included abstinence, a vegetarian diet, colonics, and cornflakes. Many famous patients came for Kellogg's cure, including President William Howard Taft, Thomas Edison, and Amelia Earhart. Several years earlier, Dr. Kellogg and his brother Will had developed a method of producing flakes from wheat and corn by first steaming it and then using heavy rollers to flatten it into flakes. Tired of their old porridge, his patients loved it, and Kellogg's Cornflakes was born. Will went on to found the Kellogg Company. Today, it's one of the world's most recognized brands, and it's still headquartered in Battle Creek, which is also known as Cereal City. Local legend has it that when the building's architects surveyed Kellogg executives, most said they wanted a corner office, which is how the Kellogg headquarters got its unique shape. The corn for Kellogg's Cornflakes no longer comes from Michigan. And these days, Michigan farmers are experimenting with a new kind of crop, one that Dr. Kellogg would most certainly disapprove of. This is Michigan wine country. There are now 14,600 acres of vineyards in the state. Most grow juice grapes, but some 100 vineyards now produce Michigan wine. Vintners here on the old Mission Peninsula like to point out that their vineyards lie on the 45th parallel, the same latitude as such celebrated French wine regions as Alsace, Bordeaux, and Burgundy. For now, most winemakers here only sell locally, but they're hoping that will change. Michigan wine country also lures Detroiters and other city dwellers seeking a summer escape. And when they do, there's no rush to get back home. In Michigan, summer holidays are so treasured, they've even been written into law. The name Michigan is a Native American word meaning big lake. But that doesn't just refer to the 4 Great Lakes that border the state. It also refers to Michigan's more than 11,000 inland lakes, like this one. These are the turquoise waters of the longest and deepest inland lake in the state. Torch Lake has been called one of the most beautiful in the world. It's one reason Michiganders spend their summers right here at home. They paraglide over the shore bluffs of Benzie County and ride the dunes of Silver Lake State Park. Summer holidays are so important in this state that the Michigan legislature weighed in and made it official. Schools are not allowed to start classes before Labor Day. And just before school begins, tens of thousands leave their holidays behind and gather for an annual Labor Day weekend ritual. The opening game of the University of Michigan's Wolverines football team. no university, and not even any team in the NFL can beat Michigan's Big House, the largest football stadium in the country. For years, the Big House and Penn State's Beaver Stadium battled for that title. But in 2010, the University of Michigan spent $226 million to make their stadium even bigger and successfully beat out Penn State's by 3,329 seats. Official seating capacity is 109,901, but attendance at most games tops 110,000. Today, all seats for this game against Western Michigan are sold out, which is why tickets were being scalped for up to $4,000. What makes this stadium so unique for its size is its understated design. There's no giant dome or retractable roof. The Big House was built in the 1920s on land that contained an underground spring. During construction, the moist, unstable earth swallowed a crane, which, according to legend, still remains buried beneath the field. Today's players are following in the footsteps of football legends Tom Brady, Tom Harmon, Desmond Howard, and even President Gerald Ford, who played center for the Wolverines in the 1930s. Past attendees could have included Google co-founder Larry Page, actor James Earl Jones, the late Dr. Jack Kevorkian, or even Madonna, all former students at the U of M. But football hasn't been the only history maker on this campus. In the beginning of the 1960s, a much smaller group of Michigan students gathered on these steps of the Student Union to hear presidential candidate John F. Kennedy during a midnight campaign stop. He urged them to contribute part of their lives to America, a plan that later became the Peace Corps. During the Vietnam War years, the campus was alive with gatherings and protests for peace. Michigan faculty led the country's first teach-in in 1965. 2 years later, hundreds of students occupied the administration building in opposition to the university's defense contracts. The students were taking a cue from Michigan's auto workers, whose own sit-down strike 31 years earlier had brought one of the world's biggest industrial corporations to its knees. It happened in the automotive manufacturing center of Flint, about 57 miles northwest of Detroit. This now abandoned building was once part of General Motors' Fisher Body Plant No. 1, where workers assembled GM's cars. And it was here, on the evening of December 30th, 1936, that those workers locked themselves in and sat down. Day after day, they refused to work or to leave, demanding better pay and union recognition. Strikes spread quickly throughout other GM factories, and assembly line workers and police battled. 44 days later, after its assembly lines had stopped altogether, GM gave in. The company signed an agreement recognizing the United Auto Workers as the sole bargaining agent for its employees, ushering in a new era for labor and industry. But within 3 years, many of America's unionized auto workers weren't making cars, but machines of war. In 1940, President Roosevelt ordered automakers to retool their assembly lines for trucks, tanks, and bombers. At the time, this plane, the B-17, was one of America's most advanced aircraft. To handle production of a new, longer-range B-24, Henry Ford built a revolutionary assembly plant, Willow Run. It was the world's largest factory at the time, turning out one B-24 every hour at its peak. Each new plane took its first flight from here, the Willow Run Airfield in Ypsilanti. By the war's end, Willow Run had turned out more than 8,000 planes. Both B-24s and B-17s, like this one, served as America's frontline bombers in Europe. 5 years earlier, the United Auto Workers leader Walter Reuther had argued that America's battles can be won on the assembly lines of Detroit. And World War II proved that he was right. Detroit quickly adopted the nickname the Arsenal of Democracy. In the 1950s, business boomed again, at least for the big three automakers. Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler flooded the market with stylish, cheaper models and sold 60 million cars in one decade alone. But Detroit's smaller car makers struggled. This vast industrial complex was one of the most advanced factories in the world when it was built in 1903. Not only did it produce some of America's most luxurious and sought-after cars of the 1930s, but it also introduced the world to an architect who would transform Detroit's skyline, Albert Kahn. Kahn, a German immigrant, employed the revolutionary building technique of reinforced concrete instead of strengthening its structure with wood alone. The resulting factory was sturdy, spacious, and efficient. The legendary Packard brothers stopped producing their luxury cars here in 1956, unable to stay competitive with the big three. Their nearly mile-long plant has become one of the most visible symbols of Detroit's decline. But while Detroit companies like Packard were starting to falter, music began to thrive. Motor City was reborn as Motown. In 1959, a young composer and entrepreneur named Berry Gordy bought this unassuming house on Detroit's Grand Avenue. He turned it into the headquarters of his new Motown Records. Soon, history was being made in Studio A, a converted basement where round-the-clock recording sessions produced the distinctive Motown sound. A stunning array of local talent sang and socialized here. Smokey Robinson, Diana Ross and the Supremes, The Temptations, and Stevie Wonder. Gordy's studio, also called the Hit Factory, produced more than 100 top 10 singles. Today, these historic studios have been turned into the Motown Museum, and the Motown label is now headquartered in New York. Gordy sold it to MCA Records in 1988. The popular soulful tunes of Motown echoed across an ever-changing Detroit. By the end of the 1960s, unemployment was on the rise. Newcomers looking for work faced housing shortages. White police abuse in African-American neighborhoods fueled existing racial tensions. By 1967, it had all reached a fever pitch. And then, on a hot July night, the city exploded. It started here, at this intersection at Claremont Avenue and 12th Street, just blocks from the Motown studio. Dozens of people had gathered at a small bar for an after-hours party to celebrate 2 Vietnam vets. But the police raided the gathering, and violence broke out. A riot began. Businesses were looted, buildings burned, and the violence quickly spread. Even the National Guard was unable to bring order. By the time the famous Detroit riots subsided 5 days later, 43 people were dead and thousands injured. It's been more than 40 years since the riots, but Detroit still struggles with uneasy race relations, poverty, and crime. Problems that are symbolized by one famous city street, 8 Mile. This long, straight road is the dividing line that marks the boundary between the city of Detroit and its northern suburbs, between its poorer neighborhoods and its wealthier ones. Many know 8 Mile today as the title of a 2002 film starring the Detroit hip-hop artist Eminem. Born Marshall Mathers, Eminem lived just north of 8 Mile as a teenager, but crossed this boundary to take part in Detroit's freestyle rap battles. Music, Eminem sings, is the only way that I know how to escape from this 8 Mile road. M&M's success did enable him to break free from 8 Mile, but he didn't go far. He now lives in this 29-room home near Rochester Hills, just outside of town. M&M hasn't been the only famous artist to put Michigan on the big screen. In the 1980s, a scrappy Michigan filmmaker arrived in Detroit and turned his exploration of the auto industry into a cult classic. In 1988, documentary filmmaker Michael Moore, armed with a camera, knocked on the ground floor entrance of the General Motors' former headquarters, which then stood a few miles away from its present location here in downtown Detroit. He was hoping to have a meeting with GM's chairman, Roger Smith. But instead, he was escorted out again and again, which became the story of his film, Roger and Me. General Motors' current headquarters, a complex known as the Renaissance Center, was originally built to help pull Detroit up after its devastating 1967 riots. But by the time Michael Moore arrived in town, Michigan's auto industry was also facing hard times, or at least its workers were. Things were particularly bad in Moore's hometown, Flint, where GM was born. Flint had lost 40,000 auto jobs as car makers moved their work overseas, while GM itself was recording record profits. On top of this giant slab of concrete was once the Buick assembly line. It housed 28,000 workers during peak production in the mid-1980s. Now, the only evidence of this plant is the green lawn that greeted executives as they arrived for work. Moore never got the meeting he wanted with Roger, but he did succeed in highlighting the corporate greed that led to the layoffs and turned once thriving factories like this one into toxic cleanup sites. And Flint hasn't been the only place in Michigan to suffer. With the decline of the auto industry, Detroit has lost nearly 1 million residents in the last 60 years, and the exodus continues. Between 2000 and 2010, Michigan was the only state in America to lose population. The vast facilities of the automakers are disappearing or being reborn. The Packard plant is now a giant canvas for some of the world's best-known graffiti artists. After one known as Banksy tagged here, a local gallery owner cut out his work from the Packard plant's wall so he could show it in his gallery. Entire city blocks have been vacated, and M&M has featured Detroit's ruins in his music videos and movie. But despite the decay, there are many who would never leave Detroit, no matter how hard times get. Like die-hard fans of the Detroit Tigers, who play here at Comerica Park. For years, this park also had the reputation of being a right-handed hitter's nightmare. Players and fans alike complained about the farther than usual left field wall. So in 2002, the team moved the wall 25 feet closer to home plate. And that year, the Tigers hit 77 more home runs. But the next year, they had an impressive losing streak, one of the worst in American League history. But that doesn't seem to stop Tiger fans from coming. And there are those who live for the city's annual Jazz Fest, one of the largest free jazz gatherings in the country. Today, Michigan's economy is still step in step with the revenues of its automobile industry. And these days, those fortunes depend increasingly on sales overseas, in Europe, China, and other emerging markets. But production at home continues. Every day, at Ford's Dearborn truck plant, up to 800 F-150s are loaded onto trains and shipped across the U.S. The F-150 remains the best-selling vehicle in America, 34 years running. Out on the proving grounds, new vehicles are put to the test every year. Their quality and performance may have a big impact on Michigan's future for years to come. But there's always been much more to the Wolverine state than the automobile. The towering dunes that line its coast, the pristine waters of its inland lakes, the brilliance of its skies, and Michigan's people, who transformed this ancient land with the simple tools of water, timber, steel, and a spirit that's still alive today. High above its Mackinac Straits, celebrating the land that is Michigan.